The first wave landed on Okinawa, and no one fired. After everything the Marines had seen in the Pacific, this made no sense. At Tarawa, men were hit before they even reached the beach. At Iwo Jima, the enemy waited underground, hidden and prepared. But here, there was nothing. No machine guns, no artillery, no movement. Landing craft reached the shore. Troops stepped into the water. Units moved inland almost without resistance. For a moment, it looked like something had gone wrong. Or worse, that it had gone right. But the island wasn't empty. Japanese forces had made a different decision. They abandoned the beaches completely and built their defense inland, inside ridges, caves, and positions that couldn't be destroyed from the sea. The deeper American forces moved, the more exposed they became. There were no clear targets, no visible front line, just terrain, and fire coming from places that couldn't be seen. Okinawa didn't begin with chaos, it began with silence, and that silence meant the battle hadn't started yet. Chapter 1: Strategic Necessity. The final phase of the Pacific War required a position from which sustained operations against the Japanese home islands could be supported. Following the capture of the Marianas, long-range bombing had become possible, but the limitations of distance, escort range, and recovery operations imposed constraints. A forward base closer to Japan was required to reduce those constraints and enable continuous pressure. Okinawa was selected for that role. Its location placed it within operational reach of Kyushu while offering terrain suitable for airfield expansion, naval anchorage, and large-scale troop deployment. Control of the island would allow for fighter escort coverage, staging of additional bombing missions, and establishment of a logistical hub capable of supporting extended operations. It also presented a platform for any future invasion planning directed toward the Japanese mainland. American planning reflected the scale of that objective. The operation required coordination between naval forces, air support, and ground units on a level not previously executed in the Pacific. The force assigned to the assault included both U.S. Army and Marine Corps formations under a unified command structure. This integration was intended to sustain prolonged combat across varied terrain rather than achieve a rapid seizure of limited objectives. Preliminary intelligence suggested that Japanese forces had adapted their defensive approach after previous engagements. Earlier reliance on immediate shoreline resistance had resulted in heavy losses without preventing landings. Reports indicated a transition toward defense in depth, with positions constructed inland, concealed within terrain features, and designed to absorb bombardment while preserving combat capability. Terrain analysis supported that assessment. Okinawa's southern region contained ridgelines, escarpments, and natural barriers that could be fortified to control movement and channel advancing forces. These features allowed for layered defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire, reducing the effectiveness of direct assault and increasing the time required to secure ground. Naval planning accounted for the likelihood of extended engagement. The fleet assigned to the operation included carriers, battleships, cruisers, and a large number of support vessels. Their roles extended beyond initial bombardment to include continuous fire support, air defense, and logistical supply. Sustaining these functions over time required secure sea lanes and protection against threats that could not be neutralized through conventional means alone. Air operations were expected to encounter a different form of resistance. Intelligence assessments indicated that Japanese air forces were no longer capable of maintaining conventional air superiority. Instead, their operational focus had shifted toward methods intended to disrupt naval operations directly. These methods prioritized impact over survivability and were expected to target ships supporting the landing force. Logistical preparation reflected the expectation of prolonged combat. Supplies were stockpiled to support sustained operations, including ammunition, medical materials, engineering equipment, and fuel. The scale of the landing required not only initial delivery but continuous reinforcement across beaches that would need to remain operational under contested conditions. Command structures emphasized coordination across all elements. The integration of ground forces required clear delineation of operational sectors while maintaining the flexibility to respond to evolving conditions. Naval and air support would need to adapt in real time based on reconnaissance and the identification of targets that were expected to be concealed or difficult to locate. As preliminary bombardment began, its effectiveness remained uncertain. While surface targets were engaged, the depth and concealment of defensive positions limited the ability to assess damage. Previous engagements had demonstrated that visible destruction did not necessarily correspond to reduced defensive capability. The operation was designed to establish control over a strategically critical island. However, the nature of the expected resistance indicated that this control would not be achieved through a single phase of assault. It would require sustained engagement against a defense structured to delay, absorb, and respond under conditions that limited the advantages of superior firepower. The initial approach to Okinawa reflected both accumulated experience and unresolved uncertainty. Lessons from earlier battles informed planning, but the adaptations made by Japanese forces introduced variables that could not be fully measured before contact. The landing would determine whether those adaptations had fundamentally altered the nature of the engagement, or whether they would reinforce patterns already observed in the Pacific Campaign. Chapter 2: The Western Beaches. The assault on Okinawa began with a concentration of naval and amphibious forces positioned along the western coastline of the island. Preliminary bombardment had targeted coastal areas and inland positions for several days, focusing on known installations and suspected defensive zones. The objective was to reduce the immediate threat to landing forces and disrupt any coordinated response during the initial phase of the operation. Landing zones were selected based on terrain suitability and proximity to key objectives. The western beaches provided relatively favorable conditions compared to other Pacific islands. The shoreline allowed for large-scale deployment of landing craft, while the inland terrain offered access routes toward airfields identified as primary targets. These features supported rapid movement from sea to land and enabled the buildup of combat power within a limited time frame. Units assigned to the first waves included elements of both the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, organized to secure the beaches and advance toward designated objectives. Engineers were tasked with clearing obstacles, establishing exit routes, and ensuring that subsequent waves could land without delay. Naval gunfire support was positioned to engage any emerging resistance, while carrier-based aircraft maintained patrols to detect and respond to potential air threats. As the initial waves approached the shoreline, the expected pattern of resistance did not develop. There was no concentrated fire from the beaches. Machine gun positions, if present, did not engage the landing craft. Artillery did not immediately target the landing zones. The movement from water to shore was conducted with minimal interference, allowing units to disembark and organize more quickly than anticipated. This absence of immediate engagement altered the tempo of the operation. Instead of establishing a contested foothold under fire, units were able to expand the landing area and move inland in a more coordinated manner. Equipment and supplies were brought ashore with reduced disruption, enabling a faster buildup of operational capacity. Communication between units remained intact, supporting coordination across multiple landing sectors. Engineering units advanced rapidly to prepare routes for vehicles and heavy equipment. Bulldozers and specialized teams cleared access points, stabilized sections of the beach, and marked pathways for movement inland. These efforts ensured that logistical support could be maintained as the operation progressed beyond the shoreline. The capture of nearby airfields became an immediate priority. Their location relative to the landing zones allowed for early access, and their operational value was significant. Securing these facilities enabled the deployment of aircraft to support ground operations and provided a forward base for continued air activity. Units advancing toward these objectives encountered limited resistance during this phase, allowing for relatively quick control. Despite the lack of engagement at the shoreline, command elements did not interpret the situation as favorable in a conventional sense. Intelligence had indicated a substantial defensive presence on the island. The absence of resistance suggested a deliberate choice rather than a deficiency in capability. Units were instructed to maintain defensive posture while advancing, anticipating engagement once they moved beyond the areas affected by naval bombardment. reconnaissance efforts began to identify terrain features further inland that were consistent with a defense in depth. Elevated positions, natural barriers, and areas offering concealment were noted as potential locations for fortified lines. The pattern aligned with observed changes in Japanese defensive doctrine, emphasizing delayed engagement and preservation of forces for sustained resistance. Naval forces continued to provide support, but their focus began to shift. With no immediate targets along the beaches, attention moved toward suspected positions inland and the detection of emerging threats from the air. Radar operators and air patrols monitored for signs of incoming aircraft, aware that the lack of ground resistance did not eliminate the possibility of attack from other directions. By the end of the initial landing phase, a significant portion of the western coastline had been secured. Troops, equipment, and supplies were established in sufficient numbers to support continued operations inland. The speed of this buildup contrasted with earlier amphibious assaults where beachheads had been contested from the outset. However, the conditions that enabled this rapid progress also introduced uncertainty. The absence of resistance at the shoreline indicated that the primary defensive effort had not yet been engaged. The terrain beyond the initial landing zone suggested where that engagement might occur. The operation had achieved its first objective, establishing a foothold on Okinawa. The next phase would determine the cost of holding and expanding that position against a defense that had not yet revealed its full structure. Chapter 3: The Southern Defensive Line. As American forces expanded from the western beaches, the operational focus shifted toward the southern part of Okinawa, where the main Japanese defensive system had been established. Movement across the central portion of the island initially encountered limited resistance, allowing units to advance and secure intermediate objectives with relative speed. This phase created a contrast between the rapid progress near the landing zones and the conditions forming further south. Reconnaissance elements supported by aerial observation began identifying terrain features consistent with a deliberate defensive layout. The southern region of Okinawa was defined by a series of ridges, escarpments, and natural barriers that provided ideal conditions for a layered defense. These features were not isolated. They formed a connected system that could be used to control movement and create overlapping fields of fire. Japanese forces had positioned their main defensive line within this terrain. Rather than relying on exposed positions, they constructed fortified areas integrated into the landscape. Artillery pieces were concealed within reverse slopes and protected positions, reducing their visibility from both ground and air. Infantry units occupied fortified lines that were designed to withstand bombardment and enable sustained resistance. American units advancing toward these positions began to encounter increasing resistance as they approached the outer edges of the defensive system. Initial contact was not characterized by large-scale counterattacks, but by controlled, localized engagements. Small arms fire, mortar strikes, and artillery began to target advancing elements, particularly those moving through predictable avenues shaped by the terrain. The ridgelines played a critical role in this phase. Elevated positions allowed Japanese forces to observe movement and adjust fire accordingly. At the same time, the structure of these ridges limited the ability of American units to maneuver freely. Movement often required advancing along narrow approaches, where exposure to fire was difficult to avoid. Attempts to bypass these positions were constrained by the interconnected nature of the terrain. American commanders adapted by organizing attacks focused on specific terrain features rather than attempting broad advances. Units were assigned to secure individual ridges, with supporting elements providing suppression fire. Artillery and naval gunfire were directed against identified positions, though their effectiveness was reduced by the concealed nature of the defenses. Air support was employed where possible, but target identification remained a limiting factor. Engineering units were brought forward to assist in overcoming obstacles presented by both terrain and defensive construction. Their tasks included clearing paths, supporting the movement of equipment, and enabling access to fortified areas. These efforts were conducted under fire, requiring coordination between engineers and infantry units providing protection. Logistical support became more complex as the distance from the landing zones increased. Supplies had to be transported across terrain that limited vehicle movement and exposed supply routes to observation and attack. Maintaining a steady flow of ammunition, medical materials, and equipment required continuous effort, particularly as engagement intensity increased. The nature of the defensive system meant that progress could not be measured in large territorial gains. Instead, it depended on the reduction of individual positions and the gradual extension of control across connected terrain features. Each secured ridge reduced the effectiveness of adjacent positions, but also exposed advancing units to new lines of fire further inland. This phase demonstrated a clear shift from the initial landing conditions. The absence of resistance at the beaches had allowed rapid establishment of a foothold, but it had not reduced the overall defensive capability of the island. Instead, it had preserved that capability for engagement under conditions more favorable to the defender. As American forces continued to press south, the defensive line revealed its depth and structure. The engagement was no longer defined by movement across open ground, but by the systematic reduction of fortified terrain. The outcome would depend on the ability to sustain coordinated pressure against positions designed to delay, absorb, and respond over an extended period. Chapter 4: Firepower and Terrain. As American units pressed deeper into the southern sector of Okinawa, the battle became defined by the interaction between terrain and firepower. The defensive system was not a single line, but a series of interconnected positions built into ridges and reverse slopes. Each elevation controlled the ground in front of it, forcing advancing units to move through exposed approaches where maneuver was restricted. The effect on operations was immediate. Infantry units could not advance in continuous formations. Movement had to be broken into small elements, using short bounds between limited cover. The ridgelines prevented direct observation of enemy positions until units were already within range of small arms and mortar fire. This reduced the effectiveness of pre-assault bombardment and required repeated engagement at close distances. American commanders increased reliance on artillery to compensate for limited visibility. Field artillery units were positioned to deliver sustained fire against suspected defensive areas. Fire missions were coordinated using forward observers who operated under conditions that made accurate target identification difficult. Adjustments were often based on indirect indicators such as incoming fire or observed movement. Naval gunfire provided additional support, particularly against larger terrain features. Battleships and cruisers engaged ridgelines with heavy-caliber shells intended to disrupt defensive positions and reduce resistance before infantry advances. However, the structure of the terrain limited the effectiveness of this fire. Reverse slopes and concealed positions absorbed much of the impact, allowing defensive forces to remain operational even after sustained bombardment. Air support was employed when weather and visibility allowed. Carrier-based aircraft conducted strikes against identified targets, focusing on areas where defensive activity had been confirmed. Coordination between ground units and air support required precise timing to avoid friendly fire, especially as engagement distances decreased. The difficulty of identifying concealed positions remained a consistent limitation. Engineering units became essential to maintaining forward movement. Their role extended beyond clearing obstacles to enabling access to terrain that would otherwise restrict advance. This included the preparation of routes for vehicles, stabilization of ground conditions, and support for the placement of heavy equipment. These tasks were conducted under fire, requiring protection from infantry units and coordination with ongoing operations. Logistics continued to shape the pace of the advance. Supply lines extended from the landing zones to forward positions across terrain that limited transport options. Roads were few and often exposed to observation from elevated positions. Movement of ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment required continuous effort, with units tasked specifically with maintaining these routes under contested conditions. Medical evacuation presented additional challenges. Casualties had to be moved from forward areas through terrain that slowed movement and increased exposure. Coordination between combat units and medical teams was critical to ensure that evacuation routes remained open and functional. The intensity of the fighting placed sustained pressure on these systems. Japanese defensive tactics emphasized controlled use of firepower. Rather than engaging continuously, positions would remain inactive until targets were within effective range. This approach conserved resources and increased the impact of each engagement. Artillery and mortars were used to disrupt concentrations of troops and supply movement, targeting areas where American forces were most vulnerable. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a shift in how progress was measured. Large advances were replaced by incremental gains tied to the reduction of specific terrain features. Each ridge secured allowed for limited expansion of control, but also exposed new areas of resistance further inland. The battle became a sequence of engagements defined by terrain rather than distance. Command decisions reflected this reality. Operations were planned around the capture of individual positions rather than broad objectives. Coordination between units, artillery, and support elements became the determining factor in whether an advance could be sustained. The interaction between terrain and firepower dictated both the tempo and the cost of the operation. Chapter 5: Attrition and Adaptation. Sustained operations against the Southern defensive system transformed the battle into one of attrition. Progress depended less on rapid maneuver and more on the ability to apply continuous pressure against positions that had been designed to endure bombardment and resist direct assault. Each engagement required coordination between infantry, artillery, engineers, and supporting fire, with outcomes measured in limited territorial gains rather than broad advances. American units adjusted their approach to account for the structure of the defenses. Assaults were organized around specific terrain features, often focusing on individual ridges or fortified sections rather than attempting to advance across wider fronts. Preparatory fire was used to suppress known or suspected positions, followed by infantry movement under covering fire. The objective was to isolate defensive elements and reduce them systematically. Close coordination became essential. Infantry units relied on forward observers to direct artillery fire onto concealed positions. Communication between elements had to be maintained under conditions that frequently disrupted lines and limited visibility. Delays in coordination could result in exposure to fire or ineffective use of supporting assets. As a result, command emphasis shifted toward maintaining control at the unit level while ensuring integration with supporting elements. Engineering units played a central role in overcoming defensive structures. Their tasks included clearing obstacles, enabling access to fortified areas, and supporting the movement of heavy equipment. Terrain conditions required continuous modification of routes to maintain supply flow. Engineers also assisted in neutralizing positions that could not be effectively engaged through indirect fire alone. The defensive system relied on controlled engagement rather than continuous resistance. Japanese forces remained concealed until American units were within effective range, then delivered concentrated fire before withdrawing to secondary positions. This pattern forced repeated engagement under similar conditions, increasing the time required to secure each objective. The use of interconnected positions allowed defensive units to maintain pressure even as individual locations were reduced. Artillery continued to be used extensively, but its limitations remained evident. While it could disrupt surface positions and suppress movement, it was less effective against deeply concealed defenses. Naval gunfire provided additional impact, particularly against larger terrain features, but the structure of the defensive system reduced the ability to achieve decisive results through bombardment alone. Air support contributed to the overall effort, targeting areas where defensive activity had been identified. However, coordination challenges and the difficulty of locating concealed positions limited its effectiveness in direct support of ground operations. Air assets were often used to interdict movement and disrupt potential reinforcement rather than eliminate fortified positions outright. Logistical demands increased as operations continued. The requirement to sustain artillery fire, supply forward units, and support medical evacuation placed continuous pressure on supply lines. Terrain constraints and exposure to observation required constant adjustment of routes and methods of transport. Units assigned to logistical support operated under conditions that were directly affected by the proximity of the front line. Medical support systems were similarly strained. Casualties were sustained not only during assaults, but throughout the process of maintaining positions under fire. Evacuation required movement across terrain that limited speed and increased risk. Coordination between combat units and medical personnel was necessary to ensure that wounded personnel could be removed without disrupting ongoing operations. The cumulative effect of these factors was a steady but limited rate of advance. Each secured position reduced the effectiveness of adjacent defenses but also revealed additional layers of resistance. The defensive system was designed to absorb losses while maintaining overall cohesion, requiring sustained effort to achieve incremental progress. Command decisions during this phase reflected the need to balance pressure with preservation of combat effectiveness. The objective was not rapid breakthrough, but gradual reduction of a defense structured to delay and impose cost. The outcome depended on maintaining coordination, sustaining supply, and adapting tactics to the conditions imposed by terrain and enemy organization. Chapter 6: Pressure at Sea and in the Air. While ground operations in southern Okinawa developed into a sustained engagement against fortified terrain, the situation at sea and in the air evolved into a parallel contest that directly affected the stability of the entire operation. Naval forces supporting the land campaign became primary targets for Japanese air attacks designed to disrupt logistics, reduce fire support, and impose continuous pressure on the fleet. American naval strategy required ships to maintain positions close enough to provide gunfire support, coordinate air operations, and sustain supply movement to the beaches. This created a predictable operational pattern that could be observed and targeted. Radar picket stations were established at extended distances from the main fleet to provide early warning of incoming aircraft. These stations, often composed of destroyers and smaller vessels, operated at the edge of the defensive perimeter. The role of these picket units was critical but exposed. Positioned forward of the main force, they were the first to detect incoming formations and the first to be engaged. Radar operators monitored airspace continuously, relaying information to the fleet and coordinating interception by carrier-based aircraft. The effectiveness of this system depended on timely detection and rapid response. Japanese air operations reflected a shift in tactical priorities. With limited capacity to contest air superiority through conventional means, emphasis was placed on direct attacks against naval targets. Aircraft were directed toward ships in ways that prioritized impact over survivability. This approach aimed to exploit the density of naval forces supporting the invasion and the necessity for those forces to remain within operational range of the island. For American forces, this required sustained air defense under conditions that did not allow for disengagement. Combat air patrols were maintained to intercept incoming aircraft, while anti-aircraft systems were used to protect individual vessels. Coordination between radar detection, fighter interception, and shipboard defenses became the primary method of mitigating these attacks. The intensity of air activity varied, but its cumulative effect was constant. Ships operating within the support area were required to remain alert for extended periods, maintaining readiness to respond to incoming threats. Damage control procedures were tested repeatedly as vessels sustained hits or near misses. The ability to remain operational after damage became as important as avoiding it. Naval gunfire support continued despite these conditions. Battleships and cruisers engaged targets inland, providing fire support for ground units advancing through the southern defensive system. This required maintaining position within range of the island, even as the threat from the air persisted. The coordination between naval and ground forces depended on the continued availability of these assets. Logistical operations were also affected. Supply ships and transport vessels had to move through contested waters to deliver ammunition, fuel, and equipment. The vulnerability of these vessels required additional protection and careful routing, which in turn influenced the timing and volume of supply delivery. Any disruption in this system had direct consequences for units engaged on land. Airfields secured during the initial phase of the operation began to support increased aircraft activity. These fields allowed for the deployment of additional fighter units to supplement carrier-based operations. The integration of land-based air support improved response times and expanded coverage, contributing to the overall defense against incoming attacks. Despite these measures, the pressure on naval forces remained significant. The necessity to maintain continuous support for ground operations meant that withdrawal or repositioning was limited. Command decisions focused on balancing exposure with operational requirements, ensuring that essential functions could continue while minimizing vulnerability. The engagement at sea and in the air was not separate from the ground battle. It directly influenced its outcome. Naval firepower, air support, and logistical supply were all dependent on the ability of the fleet to operate under sustained threat. The effectiveness of these elements determined whether pressure on the southern defensive line could be maintained. As operations continued, the interaction between land, sea, and air forces defined the character of the battle. The outcome would depend not only on the reduction of fortified positions on Okinawa, but on the ability to sustain coordinated operations under conditions that extended beyond the island itself. Chapter 7: Securing the Island. The final phase of operations on Okinawa developed under conditions defined by exhaustion, degraded terrain, and the gradual collapse of organized resistance. American forces continued to press south against a defensive system that had been reduced but not entirely neutralized. Progress remained tied to the control of specific terrain features, particularly ridgelines and fortified zones that still offered defensive value even after sustained engagement. Command decisions focused on maintaining pressure while preserving the ability to sustain operations. Units were rotated where possible to manage fatigue, though the continuous nature of the engagement limited the effectiveness of these measures. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting elements remained essential, as remaining defensive positions continued to exploit terrain that restricted movement and visibility. The reduction of the final defensive areas required concentrated effort. Artillery fire was directed against known positions, while infantry units advanced in coordinated assaults designed to isolate and neutralize remaining pockets of resistance. Engineers supported these efforts by clearing access routes and enabling movement across terrain that had been altered by prolonged bombardment. The cumulative effect of these operations gradually reduced the coherence of the defensive system. Japanese forces, while diminished, continued to engage using the same principles that had defined earlier phases of the battle. Positions were held as long as possible, with fire delivered at close range before withdrawal or collapse. The interconnected nature of the defensive system allowed for continued resistance even as individual positions were lost. This extended the duration of the final phase and required sustained effort to achieve complete control. Logistical support remained a determining factor. Supply routes, established from the western beaches, were maintained under conditions that had deteriorated due to terrain damage and continued exposure. The movement of ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment was necessary to sustain operations through to completion. Units assigned to these tasks operated under conditions similar to those at the front, reflecting the proximity of ongoing engagements. Medical systems continued to function under pressure. Casualties were managed through established evacuation routes, though the condition of the terrain affected the speed and efficiency of these operations. Coordination between combat units and medical personnel ensured that support remained available despite the extended duration of the battle. Naval and air support maintained their roles through the final phase. Gunfire from naval vessels continued to target inland positions, while air operations provided reconnaissance and limited strike capability. The integration of these elements supported the gradual reduction of remaining defenses and contributed to the stabilization of the operational environment. As resistance decreased, control of the island became more defined. Key terrain features were secured, and the ability of Japanese forces to conduct organized operations was significantly reduced. The operational objective of establishing a forward base had been achieved, though at a cost that reflected the scale and intensity of the engagement. The outcome of the battle had immediate strategic implications. Control of Okinawa provided the United States with a position from which to support continued operations against the Japanese home islands. Airfields on the island enabled expanded air activity, while its location allowed for the staging of additional forces and the support of naval operations in the surrounding region. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of a defense in depth when integrated with terrain that limited maneuver and observation. It confirmed that the absence of resistance at the point of landing did not indicate weakness, but could represent a deliberate strategy to engage under more favorable conditions. This understanding influenced subsequent planning and reinforced the need for sustained, coordinated operations across all elements of the force. The securing of Okinawa marked the completion of one of the largest operations in the Pacific War. It was not defined by a single decisive moment, but by a sequence of engagements that required continuous adaptation to terrain, defensive structure, and evolving conditions. The result was control of a strategically critical position, achieved through sustained pressure and coordinated effort across land, sea, and air. Okinawa was not just another island in the Pacific, it was the final proof of what a landing on Japan itself would cost.